What is the most disturbing true crime story you know? Well, this happened around 2014, 2015 if I remember correctly, here in Switzerland. I find it especially disturbing, since it was right about 2 villages away from where I live and many people knew the victim personally. Also, you never hear a story like this in Switzerland. It started with a news article about a house burning down. And I remember a friend in my class telling me it's the house of his friend and both their families were really close for years. A day later, when they managed to put the fire down, they discovered 5 corpses inside. Turns out, a guy held them hostage in their own house and would compel the mother to withdraw a lot of money. Later the security footages were released in which you could see how nervous and traumatized she looked. He ended up stealing around 10,000 SFR. Worst part is, it was a whole family. The mother, 3 sons aged 9, 13 and 17 and the girlfriend of the oldest brother. Autopsies later have shown that the 3 sons have been raped multiple times, probably in front of the others' eyes. The offender wasn't caught until 2 years later in the middle of the city with weapons and stuff to torture people. Really horrible story. I remember my friend's mom mourning and sobbing for days. I searched the case up and it didn't went down exactly as I remembered. Apparently it is one of the most notable crimes in Swiss history. Anyway, here is the article if you're interested. Rupperswil murder case link. Just got done reading Bodies in Barrels, the Snowtown Murders. Long story short, John Bunting, with the help of a few friends, tortured, killed, and dismembered 11 people, putting their bodies in large plastic barrels and keeping them for years. By the end he had run out of room for them, so he rented an old bank and stored the barrels in the vault. John Bunting had no sense of smell, so he got caught when the stench eventually got so bad it permeated through vault and neighbors complained. Apparently he enjoyed stirring up the decomposing human soup. I left out a lot of details, but you should totally read the book, it's pretty good and pretty ducked up. Magdalena Salas, the High Priestess of Blood. In 1963, brothers Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, a pair of petty criminals, devised a scam to swindle the population of the small farming town of Yerba Buena. They proclaimed themselves high priests of the old Inca gods and that they would bring bountiful harvests and treasure to the town in exchange for donations, food and sometimes sex. When the harvest and treasures failed to turn up, the villagers began to grow angry and suspicious. So the brothers went to Monterrey in search of a prostitute they could pay to act the part of a goddess in the farce, and made contact with Magdalena. What no one counted on was that Magdalena was insane and would quickly come to believe that she was indeed the priestess of the blood god. Only days after her arrival, Magdalena took over the cult and sacrificed 2 of the townsfolk. More human sacrifices followed and Magdalena began to drink the blood of the victims. She forced the Hernandez brothers to drink too, and soon they came to believe that she really was the awakened Inca god Phtpnk. For 6 weeks straight they butchered and consumed victims, with the surviving townsfolk sharing in the feast and blood orgies that followed. Only Magdalena was allowed to eat the hearts of the victims. In the middle of May, a 14-year-old kid named Sebastian Guerrero from a neighboring town investigated the weird fires and shouting coming from the cavern temple and saw dozens of people near naked, covered in blood, cutting themselves and eating the flesh of corpses impaled on pikes and scattered around the altars. On foot, he ran over 25 kilometers to the nearest police station and reported what he'd seen. The police did not take him seriously, but sent Officer Luis Martinez to take him back to the scene to make sure nothing was going on, and then drive him home. Neither of them were ever seen alive again. When Officer Martinez didn't come back, the rest of the police force called in backup from several local towns and went in force to the caves. Upon arrival they were attacked by the cultists, who had somehow attained obsidian knives and blades. Despite their ferocity, the officers managed to gun down most of them and were able to arrest what remained. They found the boy, Sebastian, dead on an altar. His heart had been eaten. The officer had been dismembered and one of the Hernandez brothers had also been mutilated and partially eaten. Solis, her remaining priests and 12 of the townsfolk were brought to trial on 13th of June, 1963. Each of them received a prison sentence of 30 years. Except Solis, who was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Solis still lives to this day. She has never recanted her belief that she is the avatar of Phtpnk, the blood god. Peter Scully link. He is an Australian who fled to the Philippines and operated a secret dark web child pornography website known as No Limits Fun NLF, where he and others raped and murdered children and babies. They produced videos such as Daisy's Destruction, which is so extreme that it was for some time regarded as an urban legend. It features the torture and brutal rape of a number of girls by Scully and some Filipino accomplices. The three main victims were Liza, aged 12, Cindy, 11, and Daisy, 18 months. Margaret Akalo, then project coordinator for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and an expert on child abuse investigations, described the case as horrific and the worst she had ever heard of. His crimes were deemed so severe that some prosecutors supported the reintroduction of the death penalty as punishment for Scully, despite the fact capital punishment has been abolished in the Philippines since 2006. It still gives me the chills just thinking about it. My parents grew up in Colombia during the drug wars of the 80s. My dad's brother, who was 19 at the time, went out on a first date with a girl, and a few hours later, family realized he didn't come back. The situation in Colombia was so tense at the time. If somebody was late, many people already started to assume the worst. After 2 days of not hearing from him after reporting to the police and getting nothing, my dad decided to drive to this river outside the city where many drug cartels dumped bodies. He found his brother's decomposing body along with the girl he went with. Turns out a friend of the girl he went with, who was also with them at the date, confessed that the three of them got kidnapped by the main girl's jealous ex-boyfriend, who had recently become a member of the cartels. He took them all into the mountains, castrated them all, then shot both my uncle and his date in the head. After that they dumped their bodies. And somehow the girl they went with got to escape and told the story days later on the news. Sadly, this is one of the hundreds of stories everybody who grew up in Colombia in the 80s knows. Some of you may have heard about this one. My CJ professor was a sheriff's deputy for 27 years. One day, he told us about the last case he ever worked as a homicide detective. It was so emotionally traumatic for him that he physically couldn't continue investigating homicides after the investigation concluded, and he went back to being a patrol officer for the remainder of his career. He was working in a smaller city in Arizona, a couple hundred miles away in New Mexico. A teenager, about to graduate high school, and the first of his family to be accepted into college, went missing. His family filed a missing persons report that night. After calling all of his friends and searching his local hangout places, while retracing the route he was supposed to have taken, the local police found that a gas station security camera had captured footage of him being forced into the trunk of a car by three armed men. The officers were able to get a make and model of the vehicle, but having been the mid-90s, the camera quality wasn't good enough to get a license plate. A few days later, somebody found a body in the woods near the town where my professor was working. When he arrived on scene, he almost threw up. According to the coroner's report, they'd sawed the kid's hands and feet off while he was alive. They then cut his stomach open, disemboweled him, poured gas all over his body, and set him on fire. According to my professor, there was evidence that he hadn't died until after the flames had gone out, as he dragged himself away from the spot where he'd been set on fire, and the snow around the spot where he was found wasn't melted, as the crime had happened across state lines. He worked in conjunction with both the New Mexico local police and the FBI. The investigators involved had drawn straws to see who had to be the liaison with the family, and my professor drew the short one. He said that the hardest part of the investigation was to repeatedly fly to New Mexico and personally update the family, only to tell the boy's mother that she couldn't even bury her son yet, because they didn't want to risk losing any evidence on or in the body. They'd found DNA saliva from a crack pipe that was found under a tree a few dozen yards from the body, fingerprints also from the pipe, and tire tracks in the mud. And a few months later they finally got results for the DNA. They found one of the guys in his house with a meth lab in the garage and another one sleeping in a trailer out back. They were both drugged out of their minds. They found the hacksaw that they'd used to dismember the kid, still covered in his blood, in the trunk of the car, which matched the tire tracks, along with 4 guns and about 15 pounds of meth and crack. When they were interviewed, they said that they didn't even remember what they did with the kid after they kidnapped him. They asked where the third man was, and all they would say is that the police wouldn't find him. All they said is that they were selling meth in New Mexico, saw him, and grabbed him. They couldn't explain their reasoning. That night, one hung himself in his cell with his shirt and the other chewed out the veins in his wrist a week later. They never found the third guy. There was DNA in the car that didn't match the other two. But there wasn't a match in the federal database, which was still in relatively early stages at that point. As soon as that case was done with, my professor transferred out of homicide. Charles Kennedy, a frontiersman living outside Elizabethtown, NM, with his wife and child. After the conclusion of the Civil War, they set up a rest stop for travelers. Charles would register guests into the rest stop, maybe feed them some stew. Then he would kill them and either burn or bury their bodies. In 1870, during a meal, a traveler asked if many Indians were in the area, and Charles' son replied, "Can't you smell the one Papa put under the floor?" Well, Charles went on a rampage and went on to kill both the traveler and his own son, and he buried both of them under the floorboards. He locked his hysterical wife in the house and left. She eventually escaped through the chimney and ran 15 miles to town to get help. Gunfighter Clay Allison and a posse found Kennedy and threw him in jail. However, when there were rumors that Kennedy's lawyer was going to buy his freedom, it so disgusted the citizens that Clay Allison tied a rope around Charles' neck and had him dragged by horses to his death. Tsutomu Miyazaki, better known as the Otaku Killer, was a cannibal, child rapist and necrophile who murdered 4 young girls. He would write to the families of his victims telling them how he killed their daughters. To sum up one of the murders, a 4-year-old girl vanished while playing with her friend. Miyazaki had led her under a bridge where they had a conversation that lasted half an hour. He then murdered her, where he then proceeded to have sex with her corpse. He then dumped her body in the hills near his home. He took her clothes with him. He let her body decompose. After that, he came back to remove her hands and feet, which he kept in his closet. He burned her remaining bones, made it into powder, and sent it to her family. He also sent the family several of her teeth and pictures of her clothes and a postcard. It is a horrible case and it nearly made me cry. If you want another terrible case, look up Om Shinrikyo. Viola Liuzzo. She was a Michigan housewife who believed strongly in the civil rights movement. She left her family to march on Selma and shuttle African Americans to protests and the polls. She was murdered by a carload of KKK members for betraying the race, one of which turned out to be an FBI informant. In order to shield the informant from guilt, the FBI spent the next 20 years putting out misinformation about her case and her death, going as far as to call her a prostitute, drug addict, and even a communist in the middle of the Red Scare. In reality, she was a devout Catholic and mother of 5 who had the audacity to think that equality was something worth fighting for. J. Edgar Hoover, the director at the time, personally relayed these false allegations to the goddamn president. He also blocked the convictions of KKK members who were guilty of bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. Evidence was so strong that a white jury in Alabama would have been forced to convict. But he didn't share any of the evidence and had the file sealed. He was a real piece of shit. If by true crime you mean like a crime that happened. A few years ago, I worked at a call center, and one guy on my team who was probably 40-ish started talking to me and the other guys who were all early 20s about Call of Duty. Well, turns out he and I are both into guns too. I'm like, hell yeah, I just made a friend. So he invites me to his house to shoot one day, and like we kicked it, man, just had a friendly day. So a few weeks of working together, he asks where I live, and when I tell him, he tells me his parents used to live down the street. I asked if they moved, and he dead-ass tells me this story. His perspective: my parents lived about a mile or 2 down from you. They didn't move. What happened was my sister and her boyfriend wanted money, so they killed my mother in her sleep and waited for my father to come home and shot and killed him. They tried to bury one and burn the other, but were unsuccessful and got caught. My sister is actually up for parole next year, but her BF is doing life. They had an episode of some AE crime show on it a few years ago when it happened. Holy shit, yo. I was weirded the duck out at that. I was a mail clerk in a military criminal investigations headquarters. We got case files from air bases from all over. It was a boring job, and we would read the cases to pass the time. One came in from the Philippines. An Air Force woman was in town sightseeing, and an Air Force man from her organization met her on the street. He put a gun in her ribs and make her go with him to a hotel. He spent the next couple of days raping her in all possible ways. He used unopened bottles on her and twice went down on the street and brought back groups of men to have sex with her. There were other things, but they have slipped my mind. He finally took her out, and on the street she managed to get away and ran to a cop very close by. He got 20 years in prison and the rumor was he did 3 years. Got paroled and was supposed to have raped and killed. It's hard to choose because honestly I listen to watch so much true crime. Some of the most heartbreaking are when parents torture, abuse, neglect their children to death. Then they dispose of the bodies in trash cans, with fire, etc. One of the worst was the case of Adrian Jones, who was tortured to death and then had his body fed to pigs by his parents. The sheer number of these cases in Southern California alone is disheartening. But a few non-family murders that stand out. The murder of Cherish Periwinkle. She was the little girl whose mother was conned into thinking an older, helpful gentleman wanted to give her a Walmart gift card to buy clothes for her daughter. So they shopped together for hours. There is so much surveillance video of them walking around the store. It's just so sad. Eventually he took the little girl for hamburgers at McDonald's. He passed by the one in the store, took her to his van which had most of its seats removed, and then raped and murdered her. I have a very strong stomach for grisly crime, but the testimony of the medical examiner in this case stained my spirit. It was so awful. Austin Sigg murdering and dismembering Jessica Ridgway. This one is famous online for the recording in which Austin's mother calls 911 because her son has confessed to killing the girl and still having some of her remains in various places around the house. Her torso had already been found. Austin himself gets on the phone and talks to the 911 operator. He and his mother get frustrated by how many questions she asks. The trial in this one also has stomach-churning elements. Austin was well on his way to becoming a serial killer. The sexual torture murders committed and videotaped by Charles Ng and Leonard Lake. Just Google this story. It's horrifying. Similarly, the Toolbox Murders committed by Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris in their Murder Mac. They made audio recordings of themselves torturing, raping, and killing their female victims in brutal ways. That audio was played during the trial and it was devastating and brutal for everyone except the killers to hear. Finally, I would say the Wichita Massacre committed by the Carr brothers is desperately sad. They broke into an apartment where some friends were hanging out and subjected them to a horrifying night of torture and rape before killing them. I'm pasting some of the details from the Wikipedia page about this case because if I paraphrase, no one will believe the ending. On December 14th. The brothers broke into a house at 12727 East Birchwood Drive in Wichita. Inside the property, which they had chosen at random, were Brad Hayka, Heather Muller, Aaron Sander, Jason Beffert and his girlfriend, a young woman identified as Holly G. Beffert was a local high school teacher. Hayka was a director of finance with a local financial services company. Muller was a local preschool teacher. Sander, a former financial analyst who had been studying to become a priest. Holly G. was a teacher. 5. First, the Carrs searched the house for valuables. Beffert had intended to propose to Holly, and she found this out when the Carrs discovered an engagement ring hidden in a popcorn box. After burgling the house, the Carrs forced their victims to strip naked and then bound them. They then repeatedly raped the two women and forced the men to engage in sexual acts with the women and the women with each other. After taking the victims in Beffert's truck to ATMs to empty their bank accounts, they drove them to the closed Stryker soccer complex on the outskirts of Wichita, where they shot all 5 execution style in the back of their heads. The Carrs then drove Beffert's truck over their bodies and left them for dead. Holly G. survived because her plastic beret deflected the bullet to the side of her head. She walked naked for more than a mile in freezing weather to seek first aid and shelter at a house. Before getting medical treatment, she reported the incident and descriptions of her attackers to the couple who took her in. Before the police arrived, my mom tells a story about her aunt and uncle having their home invaded. So it was a group of guys who'd escaped prison and were high and trying to hide out. They also wanted money to get more drugs supposedly. They broke into their house and duct taped them to chairs, then pumped them full of drugs. My great uncle escaped but couldn't get his wife out of their burning home, so she probably wasn't dead when the fire started and probably just couldn't escape like my great uncle did. He was horribly disfigured from the fire and obviously mentally scarred by not being able to rescue his wife from the fire. I cannot find articles about the incident as it happened in a small town back in 1994, but if anyone knows about a prison break in '94 in rural New Mexico, then it's potentially connected. The guy who did it and got out of prison was in a video about a rehabilitation job where ex-cons sell donuts. My mom saw him and started freaking out, rightfully. Which is why I heard the story the first time. I think as it's a pretty ducked up true crime story that hits close to home. I also can't remember the video where the one dude got out of prison, but if I shared that video his name would be attached to the story and I don't feel comfortable doing that anyway. Edit. I asked if she could recount the story and it turns out I forgot some details that I fixed in the second paragraph. The Toolbox Killers. They recorded on tapes the sounds of them torturing their victims. The tapes have never been released to the public, but snippets of them could be heard on old news recordings of the day they played them in court. The tapes were so emotionally jarring people got up and walked out of the courtroom, many of which were in tears. Jurors were even putting papers up in front of their faces to hide their tears. I think I also heard that the FBI used to play the tapes for new agents so they could get a grasp on some of the awful things they'd see here during their careers. Of all the awful shit I've ever seen on the internet, this got to me the most. Truly awful. I'm sure some may go look for the old news videos, but I strongly caution everyone with looking up transcripts of the tapes. Yes, they play the tapes on FBI instruction classes to desensitize the trainees from the reality of the job. Scott Glenn, when he was preparing for his role as the FBI director. Jack Crawford, in Silence of the Lambs, was actually brought into the FBI building and they played the tapes for him. Apparently, the tapes were so disturbing that he wept by the end of it, and he even changed his stance on the death penalty. He opposed it beforehand. The Toolbox Killer, aka Dave Parker Ray, was a killer who had accomplices such as his own daughter and friend kidnap girls, then he would proceed to chain them up on a doctor-like table and then torture and rape them. I heard there was a mirror above the victims so they could see what was happening to them, but I am not sure if that's true because I couldn't find anything on it. Dave Parker Ray would torture the victim with surgical tools, rape them himself, and used many homemade, very disturbing sex toys, and I also heard he let some friends rape his victims as well. He was good at making the sex toys because he was a mechanic. Dave would normally kill the victim or have his friend kill them by strangulation. If he didn't kill them and just drug them, he would use some sort of drugs or drug mixtures that would cause the victim to not know exactly what happened and ditch them somewhere. Police were never able to recover a body, but it's said that he killed 60+ women. The reason Hess called to Toolbox Killer is because the place he held women captive was a trailer near his house on the outskirts of his town. I am not sure the town name. He called it the Toy Box or Satan's Den. Before he proceeded to torture rape his victims, he would play a tape saying this isn't going to be exact but around the same. Warning. What you read in the quotes are Dave Parker Ray's words and can be very disturbing, so be advised. Hello biatch. You already know that you are being held here against your will. You are merely a pretty piece of meat, with a nice posse and a hole. I will proceed to rape you in all your holes. And after I will drug you so you can't remember a ducking thing. Have a good day. When I first heard it I got chills, and it is generally creepy. He was finally arrested after he had a woman in his toy box escaped. I can't remember her name, but she was there with Dave's daughter and she left the chain keys on the table next to her and she lunged at it, freeing a hand, and she got free after fighting with Dave's daughter for a bit. She then fled to the neighbor who called the cops. Dave Parker Ray was arrested that day. Another thing Dave did to his victims was put them in this weird box at night while he slept. He had a trial that lasted 2 weeks. The woman that escaped testified against him, but her memory was very foggy so she couldn't remember anything but when she was kidnapped. Dave tried to convince the jury that it was just some bondage kink, but the escaped victim called him out, but the jury was split between guilty and not guilty, so they had a retrial that lasted 2 months if I remember right. His friend testified against him and told them the truth, that he had been kidnapping girls and torturing and raping them, and said how Dave made him kill one of them. I can't exactly remember how the trial went, but he ended up getting around a 230-year sentence but died from heart failure 8 months in. That's the horrifying story of Dave Parker Ray, aka the Toy Box Killer. It happened on a reservation that I grew up on. Nice quiet native kid who was a bit standoffish but never a jerk was called to the office one day. Murders on reservations are handled by the FBI. At least that was the case when I was growing up. Anyways, he apparently was told by these FBI agents that his grandmother was found murdered. I guess they asked him if he had any information and he confessed everything. It came out that his grandmother was an alcoholic drunk that would beat this kid all the time. Grandparents tended to raise the children on the res. He got sick of it and snapped. He waited. Today I learned she passed out one night. Tied her up and dragged her outside. He buried her in some strange position, but up to her neck with just her head sticking out, next to an anthill. When the sun came up, he cut off her eyelids and the red ants went at her. I never heard what the actual cause of death was. So this freaked the whole ducking town out, very small town. By lunchtime, the story had gotten around our high school and the businesses in town. Our teachers announced at the end of lunchtime that school was going to be closed the next day, Friday. But we had to be back on Monday. The news was just disrupting everything. I remember going to the local trading post and the look of shock on the faces of the elders sitting on the benches in front of the store. In the store, people were talking in whispers. Everyone was in shock. It was like this happened to your own grandmother or something. Shit like this hadn't happened in a long time. Just writing this down, I am chilled all over by it. We obviously never saw the kid again. He was a sophomore. But that story haunted daily conversations until I left the res a few years later. Jodi Arias. Very disturbing case. She was meant to go on a business trip with her boyfriend, maybe ex at the time, to Cancun. However, he asked to change his travel companion to a female friend instead. Therefore she murdered him by stabbing him 28 times, slicing his throat from ear to ear, then shooting him in the left cheek. Then proceeded to travel across state right after to her ex-boyfriend for a hookup. Her defense in the trail was labeling him as a control freak, abuser, and child pedophile, and that she had to shoot him in self-defense when he lunged at her. Pathological liar, and she still lies about the incident now, while she is serving life in prison. The Alexander family, which occurred in the 70s. Yet you don't hear about it as often as you'd think. Harold and Dagmar Alexander were a married couple living in Dresden, Germany, and part of the Lower Birth Society, which was a small religious cult. The leader of the group claimed to be a prophet and the voice of God on earth. And after the leader's death, Harold claimed he inherited the prophethood. In 1954, the couple had their second child, Frank. Harold then stated that Frank was the prophet, and everything Frank said was to be taken as the word of God and law, and must be obeyed by all within the cult and family. This included his older sister, Marina, and his younger sisters, Sabine and Petra, who were twins. When Frank became a teenager is when things took a turn towards the disturbed. He decreed that having sex with someone outside of the family was impure and blasphemous, and ordered that his family only have intercourse with each other. This included his mother and sisters. Amazingly, they all agreed because they thought it was their way of serving God. Rumors about the family began to spread locally, and when police began to investigate them, the Alexanders packed up and moved to the Canary Islands. There they lived a private life and the neighbors didn't know much about them, but for the fact that they played organ music during the day and night. By December of 1970, the family had been in the Canary Islands for 10 months. And on the 22nd of December, Sabine was working as a cook at the mansion of a doctor. The doctor was surprised when Harold and Frank arrived at the villa caked in what appeared to be mud. They asked for Sabine to come out so they could speak to her. And when she did, that's when the doctor overheard them saying, "Sabine dear, we wanted you to know at once that Frank and I have just finished killing your mother and your sisters." One would think that upon hearing such morbid news, she would have cried or ran away. But instead she grasped her father's blood-stained hands and said, "I am sure you've done what was necessary." Harold then noticed the doctor was there and turned to him and admitted, "Ah, you've overheard. We've killed my wife and other daughters. It was the hour of killing." The doctor told the remaining members of the Alexander family to wait on his front patio. He ran inside and called police. The police took Harold and Frank into custody and detectives entered their apartment, to which they discovered the most gruesome scene we had ever seen. Blood was splattered everywhere. And in the living room were the corpses of Marina and Petra. Their breasts and genitals were cut out and nailed to the wall. Dagmar had been found in the bedroom and suffered the same grisly fate as her daughters. Upon questioning, Frank claimed he murdered his mother with a clothes hanger first because she looked at me wrong. And upon seeing the bloodshed, Harold claimed it was the hour of killing, so he played organ music while his son was slaughtering and mutilating his family. Both father and son claimed that the women of the family knew and accepted their roles in the foretold hour of killing, which Frank had stated over the years could come at any moment, and remained unrepentant because they claimed they sent the women to heaven. Both were deemed unfit to stand trial due to mental health issues and were sent to a psychiatric hospital to remain there until death takes them. Sabine changed her name and ended up living with a coven, and her whereabouts are unknown. This one never gets mentioned in these threads. Several kids were kidnapped and murdered in 1976-77 in Michigan. The murderer would dress their bodies very nicely with freshly ironed clothes, and then display their bodies like trophies in easy-to-spot locations, sometimes right in front of a police station. When one boy was kidnapped, his mom was interviewed. She was an emotional wreck obviously, and said she wanted her son back just so she could take him to get his favorite meal, Kentucky Fried Chicken. Several days pass and the boy is found dead, displayed as a trophy with clean clothes and his belongings neatly placed beside him. When an autopsy was performed, they recorded the contents in his stomach. It was Kentucky Fried Chicken. The killer has never been identified or caught. Man, there's way too many just to pick one. One of the craziest ones in my opinion though was Charlie Brandt. Him and his wife were sheltering at their niece's house to get away from Hurricane Ivan. They lived in Florida. While at the niece's house the entire time Charlie was complaining and wanted to go back to their home. Then one day their niece's friend, who was in regular contact with their niece, didn't hear back at all and was worried. The friend decides to go visit the house and couldn't get in because the door was locked and no one was answering, even though all the cars were there. She tries to go in through the garage where she is given the shock of her lifetime. I think she saw it though, a garage window or something. But she saw Charlie's body hanging in the garage. At that point she called the police, who upon entering discovered Charlie's wife stabbed to death. The police went to the bedroom and in there they found the niece's body taken apart, disemboweled and decapitated. Her head was placed next to the body almost as if it was made to look at what killer was doing to her. Police were trying to figure what the duck could have happened. Most evidence suggested that Charlie Brandt was the killer and then he killed himself, but they couldn't figure out with no motives or any past record. Until Charlie's sister came to the scene and explained everything. Police asked her what could be the reason or whatever, and then she explained Charlie has killed before but there was no record. It's revealed that when Charlie was still a kid, I think 12 years old, and his family were all living in Indiana at the time, he had brought a gun up to his parents' bedroom and shot both of them in the bathroom. I think he shot his mom many times in the bathtub and his dad only once or twice. He then went to his sister's room and he pointed the gun at her, and movie cliche incoming, the gun goes click. At this moment Charlie seemed to have some sort of oh my god moment, what happened, as if he was never in control of himself. He started crying or freaking out and stuff, and his sister comforted him and stuff and made it seem like everything will be okay until she finally got the chance that she could run for it. She took off to the neighbors and called the police. The mother had passed away due to the wounds but the father survived. Charlie wasn't charged for the murder because he was only 12, but he was placed in some sort of mental facility. I think he was supposed to be there a few years, but his dad idiotically took him out early. Everyone truly believed that Charlie was just possessed by a demon or something and wasn't himself for that moment. So anyways, the dad decides to relocate that family to Florida to have a fresh start, and everyone basically pretended like nothing ever happened. Everyone thought he was normal again. But over time there was so many signs. When Charlie started seeing his wife, his sister was also already married. Charlie's brother-in-law knew the whole story from the sister. So when Charlie got married, his brother-in-law asked him if he told his wife about the thing that happened in Indiana. The brother-in-law told him that she should know. Charlie shrugged it off like nothing basically. Charlie even apparently made some weird comments about the female's body to his brother-in-law too. No one ever took it seriously enough though. Even the diagram on his door of the female anatomy that police found in their investigation didn't raise red flags for anyone. After figuring out what happened, police in Florida were fairly confident that Charlie could have been linked to quite a few cold cases in the area due to the manner in which he killed his wife's niece. This had never been confirmed due to lack of evidence, and the suspect currently residing in hell. I don't. How many of you are going to read this? But even if I get one upvote, it'll feel great knowing someone appreciated it. Wikipedia won't tell you the story in the order you need to hear it. I remember all of it off the top of my head from a podcast I used to listen to. I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, but here's one from my own life. When I was about 12 or so, there was a single woman who lived on my street, probably no more than 100 yards down from my house. She had recently gotten engaged and was planning on selling her house to move in with her fiancé. After an open house, a potential buyer asked to come by and view the house again privately, as he claimed to be very interested. It was actually an unnaturally dark and stormy day when the man came for his viewing. A few days later, a fellow neighbor became concerned because the woman used to take her 2 dogs on morning walks with this neighbor and a few others, and they had not been able to get a hold of her. She had a key to the woman's house for dog sitting purposes and decided to let herself in. The first thing she noticed was the dogs were terribly stressed. running all over the house crying as she came in. They had also peed all over the living room. She walked through the home calling the woman's name to no response until finally she made it to the master bedroom. There in the master closet she found her, clearly raped and strangled to death. I still remember coming home from soccer practice that day and seeing tons of police out in front of the house. The guy was actually caught pretty quickly because get this, the realtor helping with the open house talked to this guy during the event and was so creeped out by him she actually kept a brochure he had held and they were able to get his fingerprints. Turns out he had recently gotten out of prison for assaulting several other women. I still think about how terrifying it must have been for that woman as this guy viciously attacked her alone her home during a terrible thunderstorm. So, there you go. Now you can be afraid of selling your house on top of whatever other illogical fears you may already have. Former emergency room right now here. Long time ago. Galaxy far away thing. Not a famous case, but my very first baby code resuscitation was a murder victim. I had to give a deposition and everything. It happens really fast. And I won't give you the blow by blow. But they put the 10-month-old on the gurney and I am in charge of 4 access. So I stripped the onesie off of him. Getting cold. Pasty. Gray baby poop up my arm. This is the part of my testimony that was important. You're not dead today, I learned you're warm and dead. That baby was ice cold and dead. Dad had strangled the baby 3 or 4 hours before bringing him in after a fight with mom. And had changed his mind. I had no clue. The doctor said rigor mortis a couple times and that didn't register. As we busted our asses trying to bring that baby back for like a half hour. I was sweating balls trying to get in 4. And since I couldn't, I put 2 intraosseous lines in. 1 in each shin. Those are pretty brutal. Dad just sat there staring. He was like a zombie. No emotion. No reactions. Not looking at anything or anyone really as we worked on his son. Which wasn't suspicious. At all. People react differently to death and tragedy. He seemed to be the normal level of so overwhelmed with what is going on that he's completely shut down. Of course we suspected the baby had been dead for a little while. This didn't just happen. His reaction didn't make anyone think this was a murder we were dealing with. However. But he was sitting right there the whole time we worked on him. After having killed that baby. This is the part that makes this story fit this thread and that I would define as disturbing. He murdered his child. And he was sitting right there. Mom, on the other hand, was hysterical. Screaming. Ripping her hair out. I don't hear her screams. But when you tell parents their child has died, they make unintelligible sounds that are more wails than screams that I still hear sometimes. This sound was more angry at the same time as anguished. The guttural, anguished ones stay with me. But hers don't. But what I understand now is she knew. She knew her husband had killed their baby. And she was grieving but wanted to get her hands on him. She wanted to tear him apart. Her family members wouldn't let her in the room with us. Yeah. It was ducked up. They fought before bed. He killed their baby and then went to sleep. Woke up a couple hours later. Woke her up. Admitted to her what he had done and then they brought the baby in. It was a military base and he was military, so pretty sure he got life. Couldn't happen to a more deserving guy. Small town of 12k people. Police officer kidnapped and killed at least 2 women around 2011 but likely more as the story goes. He's been convicted since. His wife worked with my girlfriend's mom at City Hall so it was pretty intense when he was found out and convicted. My GF was single mom at the time dealing with custody issues and her mom asked that police officer to drive by her apartment on his rounds to check on her as I lived 2 hours away at college. So this officer who had killed at least 2 women at that point in time was checking up on my GF and her daughter who he was aware were home alone. About 10 years before this a minister was killed in his church because a meth head believed he had a hidden safe. Eerily similar to the murders from In Cold Blood. So many other ducked up things have happened in this town. It's basically the Derry of Missouri if you're a Stephen King reader. Not nearly as shocking as some of these but it still makes me sick. I work in a children's home. One that I used to work at had this really sweet and kind young man. 14 years old, has been in foster since he was 7 but was in the home for school etc. His birth parents would emotionally, physically and sexually abuse him and his younger sister. They would let other people abuse the kids as well. There were certain foods he physically couldn't even look at because they would remind him of what he had suffered and would cause a visceral reaction in him. Mustard was the big one. His parents would force mustard into his mouth as a punishment. It almost made me cry listening to him. His parents were convicted but didn't really serve any time. He is not allowed any form of contact with them and isn't allowed to get the ferry to his foster parents' holidays and stuff. Comes from the Isle of Wight on his own because he saw them on the ferry and they tried to contact him. Another child. Was horrifically emotionally and physically abused by his mother for the first 7 years of his life. He's 12 and has an amazing guardian now. She would force him to eat fish by shoving it down his throat and then would hit him if he threw up. She would get into a physical altercation with her partner. Both were equally abusive to each other in front of the children, and he would be forced to clean her up when she would be passed out drunk and covered in piss. At 2 years old he was found wandering the flat eating a frozen fish finger because he was so hungry. Mother still went clubbing and got drunk and high up to a week before the kid was born. Loveliest boy you would ever meet. Kind and sweet and always quick to smile. I had to give him a hug when he told me this. I was physically crying because of what he told me. Mother has never faced criminal charges. Still has supervised contact with her daughter. Not a famous true crime story. But I worked as a law clerk for the public defender's office in my town one summer. A man and his wife separated because he abused her. He was stalking her. So she got a restraining order. He kept stalking her. She called her friends and the police and told them she didn't feel safe and thought he might hurt her. One day he thought she had a new boyfriend. He went to her house with a baseball bat. Her son, who was a teenager, tried to stop him. But he broke his arm. The son ran off to call the cops. The man bashed the woman's skull to a pulp in the backyard. He then called all his friends and family to tell them that he killed her. He didn't seem proud of it. Was just very matter of fact about the whole thing. I had to review the entire file, which included all the pictures of her body and all the recordings. It was pretty horrible. And then I had to help defend that monster. It's part of being a public defender, and people don't realize how much that can mess you up mentally. It's why a lot of lawyers are alcoholics. Luckily, that was just one summer. Now I do civil work. And I have no desire to ever go back to criminal. I'm from Spain, so I'll tell a recent crime, probably 2018, that happened here. A boy with mental illness lived alone with his mother. One day she went missing. And her coworkers reported it to the police. After weeks of search, officers found less than half of her body in the freezer of the apartment that shared with his son. It turns out that the boy killed his mother, cut her into pieces, and was eating her every day. When asked, he said that he loved so much his mother that felt the need to absorb her, and the only way was by killing and eating her. It was pretty shocking in my country. The story about Brian Blackwell still gives me goosebumps. He was the exemplary student and clever at school. There was a girl in his life that he liked. So he made her believe all kinds of lies by creating a fake illusion of himself and his life. For example, that he was a professional tennis player. He would steal his dad's credit card and get into so much debt to impress her with money. He wanted to take her on a trip vacation by using his dad's credit card. When his dad tried to stop him, Brian killed his dad by stabbing and beating him with a knife and a claw hammer repeatedly. When his mom tried to help his dad, he killed her too. Then he went on a trip with the girl like nothing had happened, with 2 dead parents in his home. He was later diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. About 18 years ago in my town, a young man drove home from college out of town one night and went to his parents' house while they were sleeping. His younger brother was still living at home. And the young man killed the family dog, set the house on fire, and left to go back to college. All 3 in the house died, with the younger brother collapsed in a doorframe. The day after this happened, I wondered where my lab partner for aquatic science was, as it was 8:30 a.m. and he was never late. The principal came into class and whispered some quiet words to our elderly teacher. And she gasped and started crying. We all got the news right after her. The ducked up part was we all felt bad for the older brother, as he was off at college and his family all died in a house fire. We even made gifts and cards for him. Then about a week later it came out that he did the deed. It was a big uproar in town. And no one really mentioned it after about 2 years once he had been sentenced to life in prison. I honestly can't remember John's last name. I remember what he looked like, what his voice sounded like. And he liked ping pong and was better than I was at dissecting marine life. I live in the PNW, need I say more? It seems like at the breeding ground for serial killers. I went to dental assisting classes with a young woman, and one day during class the police showed up and knocked on the classroom door and asked her to step outside, and a few minutes later she came back in and was white as a ghost, looking a little green, visibly shaking, and she blurted out that they finally had found her mom, who had been missing for over 2 years. So we were like, wow. Finally you know something. She had told the class earlier when we had to share something that she really misses her mom and hoped she would hear from her soon, because she hadn't heard from her for a really long time and feared the worst, since there was a serial killer loose on the streets of Spokane. As I was helping her gather her things, she blurted out that they found her mom, Melody Ann Murfin, buried in Robert Yates's backyard, and then she fainted. We all were so stunned no one moved for a good 2 minutes, but it seemed so much longer and in slow motion. When she woke up we helped her to the table and the police came in and escorted her to try to identify the body, clothing, jewelry, etc. Just like that, in a snap. It was so surreal. She couldn't have been much older than I was at the time, 22, and I would have crumbled and had a mental breakdown, but she held her head high, dried her tears, and walked out with them. I think of her often when I am feeling defeated and think if she can muster up the courage to face that in 5 minutes before my eyes, I can do it too. Has to be Dahmer. Strictly because of how close I found myself to his family. Now that I have your attention. My best friend in high school had a nice older brother. We live in Ontario, Canada. He is about 3 years older than us. He dated a girl in high school and I remember her. She seemed nice but off. They dated for all of high school and then he ended it when he left for college. He ended up having to come back from his first semester in college because he was told by his mom that the ex was not doing well and had been committed soon after they broke up. She had cut herself a lot. Cut his name. Had books full of his name and was nearly catatonic in hospital. The older brother is a caring person, so he visited her. When he gave her name they had trouble finding her in the records. It was then that he was taken aside by the intake nurse, who explained that the reason they couldn't find her was because she had gone by her first and middle name and omitted her last name. That her name is actually Dahmer and she is Jeffrey Dahmer's niece. When he told me about this he remembered the last name showing up on their home caller ID as Dahmer, but he never made the connection and figured the name he knew her by was her mother's maiden name. Dahmer's parents forgave him and stayed in their hometown. His brother, on the other hand, was disgusted and moved illegally to Canada with just his only daughter. Apparently when you live illegally in Canada, it is ill-advised to try to have your last name changed. The home phone was associated to his credit score and therefore was listed as Dahmer. The brother said goodbye to her and moved away to college finally. Slovakia. There is one killer in our country back from 1987 minus Phtpnk. He killed his wife and 2 daughters with an axe. All this story is just hard to digest. But the worst part for me was that his wife was pregnant and he cut the fetus out of her body. And then he cut also fetus. Like he'd take out his organs and everything. I can't even think about it. It's just messed up. Edit. There are very good documentary series about all the worst cases in Slovakia. Here I found out about this crime. Of course it is in Slovak. Here is what I found it in English, since Wikipedia have just a few sentences about him and nothing really disturbing, to be honest. Warning: this is truly disturbing. He cuts all the dead bodies into pieces and masturbates over them several times, using the axe and a knife. He cuts open his wife's chest and abdomen. He cuts her breasts off and scatters her entrails round the bedroom. There is nothing to stop him. Even his wife's advanced pregnancy. Using a razor. He cuts the still living fetus into pieces and eviscerates it. He does the same with his daughter's dead bodies. Then he has sex with his dead daughter's bodies.